Go ahead and click record. Right. Okay. So I will go to Josh and Peter first, and then adding the other two items that I had linked to in the email as well. But I'll let Josh, you kick it off on the component stuff.
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep. No echo? Okay. So, yeah, I have been working over the past month or so since the beginning of December, trying to work out a conformance strategy for distribution or for distribution spec. And there was some conversation in the mailing list. Originally, we started by looking at the tests that Quay, the recently open source Quay had provided, which was a large set of Python tests that tests all sorts of different versions of the spec. So it's pretty verbose. With starting that, we had a couple issues. One of the main things, the reasons why we didn't go down that route was because it was written in Python, meaning that we could not ship the compliance suite as a simple binary. And then on top of that, it had all sorts of stuff that were Quay specific or using old versions of the spec. And then in the middle of December, we got a message from the Zot team that they were working on compliance things as well. So we started going down the route of contributing back to Zot. And I've been talking with people such as Ken Brooks from Chase and Jimmy from Quay, Red Hat, etc. And basically, the test framework that Zot was using was a little bit, it wasn't as extensible as we had hoped at first. Hello?
Still hear you.
So yeah, the test framework was called Go Convey. It was not as extensible as we had first hoped. So we first tried to extend Zot to have advanced outputs such as JUnit, and it just wasn't working with the framework that they chose to use. On top of it, there was the entire question of authentication and authorization. So what basically the Zot tests were running against a registry that was completely wide open with no authentication. So basically, I have Peter here who's working with me on this from Chicago as well. Basically, what this turned into was us trying to write a more general agnostic REST client against OCI, and basically starting a test suite from scratch, inspired by everything that Zot had done, using another test harness called Ginkgo. Yeah. So Vince, you mind if I share my screen for a minute?
No, that's fine. Do I have to do something to allow that?
I'm not sure.
I think you can just click share at the bottom. Yeah.
So this led us to build a very simple library using two main components. Resty, which is the library that this is the library that Zot decided to use for their compliance suite. Resty essentially gives you a very simple user interface for making REST calls, simple HTTP helpers in Go. And then from there, we had started to build our own authorization, our own authorization layer. And I had a conversation with Vince a couple weeks ago, trying to find out if someone had already written this code. And I compared a few different solutions. And what I ended up finding was Jess Frizzell's registry client has an exported transport layer. So reg, I think you pronounce it reg, is basically an agnostic client for doing container operations. So it's like a replacement for Docker. It has a couple other cool features, but it basically, all of the auth stuff, which isn't really part of the spec, is built into a transport layer that's in that library. So we built a simple client that is built on top of these two components, and we've added a few cool things that let you do things like this. So we've done we have a little bit of like domain specific language here, where specific strings that are found in the specs, such as name, digest, reference, and session ID, we've allowed you to specify that in the path. And then we have these option methods that allow you to specify a specific repository name. And what that ends up, the end result of all this is we can import this in the compliance tests. And so we have a fork of the compliance test. I just need to find it. One sec. So we made a fork. It's under Blood Orange. We weren't prepared to submit a PR just yet because we're still kind of working out some of the kinks. But we have here, we've broken down each of the different, what we found to be unique pieces of the spec into their own files and run them serially. So certain things like a manifest upload rely on blob uploads happening prior to, so we can reference those blobs. And then later down here, we have manifest delete and blob delete, which is the actual teardown of the suite. But for example, we'll look at chunked upload. So we have all sorts of things where you're not, instead of concatenating all sorts of strings to create basically a REST request against OCI distribution, you can just put name in here, and the client is instantiated with a default name. And we also have some helpers, like for chunked uploads, you're oftentimes given a location in the header that you need to reference later. So we have a get relative location thing that will actually return the last response's location that you can then use to create a new request. Probably another example, let's see. Here's an example of using a reference replacement. So we're making sure that we can upload multiple different things. And here's an example of using a digest in a URL. And then to run these things, we've tried to make it very easy and extensible for all sorts of different registries. So you can export these 4 different variables. If you don't put username and password, it's expected that there's no auth enabled. And I also put a note that OCI namespace, in some cases, in certain registry providers, you need to actually create that namespace ahead of time. So for people doing self-service compliance, we're hoping that there will be some README that they provide that's like, these are the steps you need before you can run it, and then you can just run go test. And now this is something we can ship as a binary when releasing new versions of the spec. And then we've also figured out a way to create an HTML report, and that's thanks to using the Ginkgo library. And that looks like something like, hold on one second.
So even though you run go test, it actually outputs artifacts?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes, and a JUnit, which you can plug into CI and all that type
And
of stuff.
so from Josh and I's talk in December, it's neat to have things available as a Go unit test. And one of the things that I recommended, obviously you could, anybody that wants to check out that piece, like any given tag of the spec and then run Go test can, but also one of the nice things is that in my mind that I've used in other projects is that you can run Go test -c to compile a binary that is supposedly forever more usable of exactly what you tested and pushed out to production at a particular tag, like distribution spec 1.0. We could have that as a release artifact, as like the binary that you could run and pass with the variables needed. So we could rebuild it later at a later point in time, but you could have like a release artifact that is the binary to test with.
Yeah, so yeah, that's what made it very important to use Go versus what Quay had done. That's pretty much all I have. And I know Ram, I think Ram is on the call. I know they're working on very similar things, and I don't necessarily think it's bad for both of these efforts to be going on in parallel. It'll, ensure even more compliance. I am hoping though that we can work together and kind of get this into the distribution spec repo in some form. So that's pretty much all I got. I'll drop the links for both of these things in the HackMD.
Hey, Josh,
It's been a long time since I've touched JUnit files. Is that XML file set up to be parsable so that if we did have I know at some point you talked about being able to have the output such that, say, Harbor runs it against some new release, like they tag a release, they run it, and then they send in the JUnit XML, or somebody runs it, that it could be like compiled into a table given the output of that JUnit XML?
Yeah, I mean, systems like Jenkins have their own JUnit viewers and things like that. But Ginkgo, the Ginkgo framework actually allows you to build custom reporters. So that's how we were able to build the HTML. But we can do all sorts of things with Ginkgo. What's it called? It intercepts each piece of the tests and things like that. But yeah, the JUnit should be pretty. I mean, JUnit is a pretty standard universal thing.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you, Steve.
No. I was just I was trying. What I was a little confused is when you're going through the 01, 02, 03 Go files, was how the flow works. If a customer is trying to test a specific registry, how do the different registries provide their uniqueness in such a way that a random person can say, hey, I want to run these tests against 3 registries. How would I do that? I just didn't understand how.
So this was another thing I talked about with Vince. There is a repo that was actually created, I think 2 years ago under open containers called something compliance. And the idea is to sort of copy what Kubernetes has done for Kubernetes conformance, where anything that's specific to your registry or your Kubernetes distribution in their case, you would give any type of pre-setup and teardown that can go before and after running the Go test. Obviously, if we run into edge cases where things need to happen in the middle, we'll need to address that. And we were thinking about additional environment variables such as like OCI test artifacts, and we'll have sort of pieces of the spec that might be, we notice there's things that are like should and probably will and things like that in the spec that we may be able to trigger additional tests or less tests based on the presence of certain environment variables.
So I guess I'm trying to understand is where you're at now. Like if I'm Ken trying to test ECR, GCR, ACR, and Quay, whatever. Just I was trying to pick three, and those are the ones that came up. As registry owners, where would we provide our uniqueness so that Ken just says, "Hey, I want to run these three tests, this test against these three registries." I don't need to know about Ken, right? Ken just knows where to go grab this stuff. There is a section that we as ACR put up, make a contribution and say, "Hey, here's our unique pieces of this test." Then he can just run it with something ACR, whatever, and then he can run it again for GCR, and he can see the results that he's looking for. Have you gotten to the point where you have that abstraction so that the registry operators can provide their unique pieces and the people that want to run the tests don't need to contact us directly?
I might be missing what you're saying, but do is like ACR needs to provide some README, right?
Well, README, or do we provide, a set of files, the unique.
No. Well, okay. So as part of compliance, and this is all just, this will be over the next few months, but the idea is that you would, I'll share the link too for what Kubernetes is doing, but you would give like for the ACR test repo, you would run this against that. You would upload the JUnit and HTML report as well as a README for someone who wants to run this on their own. But the thing that you submit would just be for your, yeah, and Chris put something in the chat. Yeah, like you would basically figure out what it means for this to run against ACR and give people the instructions for which to do on their own. Take a look at Kubernetes. I think it's /conformance testing. I'll put it in the HackMD. It's pretty scalable because people just submit PRs about their specific provider.
Steve, what do you mean by your unique stuff? Do you mean additional tests that are specific to ACR? Or I wasn't sure.
Yeah, not necessarily specific, but there's certain things that the spec doesn't specify, like whether you have to create a repo up front, whether you can have multiple nested namespaces. There's things, or whether for artifacts, whether you have to submit the artifact type up front. So while we could push up our test results and just say trust us, what I thought we were going towards is what I like using Ken is a consumer of the various registries. Ken could run the tests himself to get the results himself. But because there are subtleties around auth and repos and maybe artifacts that might be slight differences per registry, which is okay, how does each registry operator provide their uniqueness? That we will say, hey, every time you want to run this conformant test against ACR, here's the pre and post steps that Josh was talking about. If you're running against GCR or Docker Hub, here's the pre and post steps that you have to do for Docker Hub. And then Ken just has to say, I'm running this test, parameter ACR, parameter GCR, whatever. And he can now see the results. And maybe they turn a feature on that they could run the test again to say, oh, wow, when you turn on VNet and firewalls, turns out this feature doesn't actually work. And there's a README that explains, yes, that is blocked because of blue. And that's something, and here's the bug that we're using to track that. Because my fear was the opposite. The other side of it is I can't imagine any registry operator is going to post their test results unless they're 100% green. So now we just have nothing for some, and then green for others that were hopefully, a trust factor, as opposed to individual customers can run these registry tests themselves and get the results that, including on-prem, right? You know, for something like Harbor, that they can see that, oh, no, this does pass. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a couple of things here. Obviously, people could run the tool and with their auth against, like, say, I have an access to an Amazon container registry in Azure, whatever, and run it as a user and have something to look at to be comparable. But are you asking for like addendum pieces, or because it almost seems like if, like in the examples that Chris has just pasted of Kubernetes conformance, there's a README attached to them. So it might have different pieces of like what you described before. You know, Docker IO, you have to, certain calls you can't make until you have gone through the web UI and created a repo or whatever first, whereas other ones like imply it. So you can document those differences of like, here's some setup work before you run the conformance test, but it's in a README. Are you saying
is a set of steps the user has to do themselves, as opposed to here's the script that we provide that does it for you?
Either script or paste a script in a README. I think having a README to show this is the expected form, you know, expected behavior, and then the attached artifacts like the JUnit or whatever other. Kubernetes has the JUnit also, but still, here's a README and here's the output of the running the test, and it's all green. Otherwise, I mean, it could even, but ideally it would even be something in people trying to have debugging conversations or like bug reports of like, here, I ran this tool and here's the output artifacts. Here's where it says it's failing compliant. I feel like, yes, nobody's going to want to submit to if their reports aren't green, but it still needs to be clear of like, here's steps that you have to do to make it. Here's the steps done to make the conformance test run green.
I think we can evolve it in the future to have like hooks and stuff, because yeah, I think the auth's a good example of like, well, we purposely didn't have the auth spec as part of distribution, even though it is not necessarily standard OAuth. We want to do that in favor of having the HTTP spec just use kind of the standard HTTP approaches. So like we'll get back an authenticate message that says that you need to use bare auth or basic auth. And then it's up to the conformance test at that point. If you're passing a username password, then it's using kind of the Docker authorization spec, but you should also be able to just pass in a hook that can take those authentication credentials and get you back the authorization header you need. So like we could add hooks that could do pre-starts, could do artifacts and stuff like that in the future if we want to make it more advanced. But I think the overall like HTTP flow should be fine in terms of getting that in like this.
We probably want to time box this just because other agenda items. I was just trying to get a sense of which direction you were going, because I was trying to multitask and read the thing that Chris posted here, for instance, on the README for like testing AKS, for instance.
One quick question before we move on from this for Josh is the output of these different tests that are run, test steps that are run. Is there any kind of gradient possibility, or is it like most unit tests where it's just pass fail? I'm just thinking when we're testing some of the shoulds, should not, may not.
Right.
Testing.
So there's a way to
like
skip.
output that differently.
Yeah, there's a way to skip tests, and you can do it conditionally. So yeah, you can have sort of a yellow based on, for example, if we add artifact support to this as well, you can have a skipped artifact test, one test skipped, and it'd be like all green, one skipped.
Mm-hmm.
If that's what you mean.
Yeah, I guess that's getting at it. You could almost like ramp it up of like if you passed some kind of like strict mode where it tests that all shoulds as if they should be a must, and otherwise basic mode is it won't fail a test if it, on shoulds and should not. I don't know.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I'll look into that more. But the framework the Ginkgo framework does seem pretty extensible.
I mean,
Yeah.
I
So
think
it's like you might have like some return or output value that Ginkgo reports in a certain way. That's fair.
yeah, I mean, I think if in the end, it's hard to just do that based on the test, because the test may be testing multiple different things, or the actual individual line items that we may want to say works or doesn't work, and the shoulds and mays may not line up exactly with the test. So I think as long as the output like is parsable in a way where we can generate a report, like I said, like skips or greens or whatever, like as long as we know what parts of the specs and we can generate something, I think that should be fine.
Okay. Anything else on this before we move on?
I'll put something on the mailing topic that just kind of overviews what I just presented, and I'll try to seek some feedback there.
Cool. Thank you, Josh.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to quickly, the next two topics were both largely mine. Expect me to put up a vote for possibly a runtime spec release shortly. I did a big pass through several of the spec repos the holiday break. I did a pass to try and clean house on runtime spec, distribution spec, and runtime image and distribution. Anyhow, the big thing was the runtime spec had a PR that had been, the hooks PR is finally merged, and it was largely the thing that was holding up run C from hitting a 1.0. So I will be posting up a vote for the runtime spec here before long, and there hopefully allowing run C to do the needful for having its own 1.0 release. And that might also happen for Go Digest. It seems like it's gotten some activity lately, and people have been asking for a release of Go Digest for a little while. Yeah, I don't. It is basically just a heads up to anybody interested. I don't have anything particular on those, except for there might be a couple of release votes coming out, so don't be confused.
So this is where we say, yeah, right? That's good news.
Yeah, things are moving. And then lastly, we'll yield, especially due to his time of day, to Justin. If there's anything particular in the notary world, as we fire back up this, we had a good discussion and momentum right before the break, but Happy New Year. So Justin, do you have anything to say on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things we'd like to get updates from people, but I think we were just discussing in Slack that it's probably a good idea if we schedule a meeting specifically for notary, so we're not tagging on these meetings really. So if people have opinions about when, my preference would be for something that's kind of I know mid-morning Pacific or something like that, probably. Maybe on kind of Mondays or something that's, but maybe we could just have a kind of.
Would be approaching lunchtime for East Coast, and would be late afternoon for you.
Early evening or something, but I mean, the sort of 8, 9, 10 o'clock West Coast tends to be quite busy. just because everyone seems to want to have their meetings then. So I was thinking maybe a bit later, but.
Oh, you figured 8 was too clustered already with other meetings?
Well, I tend to have meetings like because it's the most popular time. But I'm sure we can.
That's fine. We can figure it out. I mean,
Yeah.
if you either post a doodle or we'll just have a thread about it. As far as I'm concerned, we can use this conference bridge line for that because we already have it, and some of the topics we'll be touching on, like the distribution spec. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think we could bring things back to this meeting, but to your point, Justin, there's large chunks of conversation that it's hard to fit into 10, 15 minutes on this call because there's usually other stuff.
Yeah. I mean, just in terms of status updates for people who are working on things at the end of last year, beginning of this year. So in terms of what I had a conversation with the NYU people about threat models, and I think I know that Steve, you saw the document I wrote for the draft doc I wrote for them, but I think we're going to have a follow up. I've got a few actions out of that, particularly to write up a document about what kinds of mirroring we want to do that I'll probably ping you on, because I know we've talked about this a bunch before. So I'm going to work on that over the next few days as well to try and get a mirroring document about what mirroring looks like and what the sort of semantics of it actually are. Steve, you had some actions, I think, as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I was a little more energetic about getting stuff before the break, and then I decided I actually need to take a break. So today's my first day back. I got some progress made on the use cases, but I really want to take a step back because they were getting too granular and so forth. So I will redo that. Today's Wednesday. I'm hoping to actually spend some time on it this week and get that in place, because I know we want to. That's kind of the beginning, because we want to do all this other stuff, referencing what it is we're trying to achieve. So I know that that's kind of a blocker, or it should be a blocker. And if it's not, that's a problem. So I will get a draft out. I will commit to getting a draft out at the end of this week, and then we'll have that as to iterate upon.
I'm just trying to remember who else had
specific model doc.
I'm sorry.
There's a kind of there's a kind of questions towards a threat model doc. I'm going to which I kind of wrote because a lot of it's a bit rough, but the aim is to turn it into a threat model doc. It's more kind of questions towards a threat model doc right now, but my action was to produce a threat. One of my actions was to produce a threat model doc, so that was kind of working towards that, and I will.
Okay. One thing that was one of my actions coming out of the before the break was to think through something like the PEP or KEP model, but for OCI stuffs. I know this topic had loosely come up during image spec and runtime spec development, but we punted on it. And for this, specifically as it relates to the distribution API, to have some kind of feature flag way to say, here's extension proposal 1 or 2 or whatever, 100, that implements the signature API or some additional stuff that a registry could do for signature objects, and then have feature flags baked in. This is all like the additive stuff that we talked about for the registry. One question to this group, since there's a fair quorum on the line. If we had some kind of like extension proposal process, like Kubernetes has a KEP, and they're generally span storage and node and all the different subsystems of Kubernetes, would people be more in favor of something that's like a distribution extension proposal, DEP, or possibly something that is like, go ahead and have it at the OCI level, because it might be touching on like the artifact effort or distribution spec or whatever, and it could just outline like an OEP top level thing, and then in a feature flag that distribution spec implement could be satisfying some aspect of that new feature, like how to handle signature objects or whatever it is. Does anybody have strong opinions on that one way or the other? Keeping extensions per spec, or go ahead and make them where they could span spec?
Is your thought that there's a generalization of how we do it and then it's implemented in each spec, or is it there's no generalization, it's just each spec talks about how it does it? I'm trying to understand your question.
Well, each spec might have information on how it implements. So say we did it at an overarching level, like being able to handle signed images or signed image objects or whatever. So there might be some mention of it in the image spec, but also like APIs added to distribution spec. And it would be like, here's where OEP 2.7 is implemented, and information on that. But I'm just saying, like, if one of them has an extension that doesn't have a corresponding way to relate across, I don't know. It to me, it's like more of an overarching place. It's really, we can decide it later. It's just something I was thinking through and reading through, like how Python has done it and how Kubernetes has done it.
So sort of like an open container / project thing, right?
Well, maybe it would almost, in my mind, go into the org repo of just like, here's proposals, and then cool, it was agreed upon by some consensus, and then corresponding PRs to satisfy that for any project that it touches on.
Makes sense.
I like having a generalized approach. That's why we don't have to do it 12 different ways.
Okay.
Yeah, I like the overall approach. Just need to consider about like, maybe it's up to whatever project they're going into, whatever repository, to define who the owners of it will be, since normally it would be the maintainers of those specific areas, but they said it may be maintainers of multiple areas that should approve it.
Yeah, that was my thought also. If there's some proposal that touches on runtime, then it must have, a quorum of the runtime maintainers approve it, or so forth. That's fair. Okay. All right, so you pasted a link to your rough note. Was there anything on the notary front?
Who else had actions out of the original meeting? I'm just trying to, or was it then? Did anyone else have actions out of that? Sorry, that I've missed. Out of the meeting in December.
Let me pull up the notes. I can.
I was trying to.
Actually, where did we put those notes? There's a hack.
There's a couple of other things that I'm still chasing on repo and Zoom. Actually, which I also need to ping
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
A few people on the line, but as far as like setting up a notary, since the notary namespace is already there, if we do something like a notary project.
Well,
namespace,
yeah. I'm just trying to find out who actually controls it, because it seems. Yeah, I've got a question now. Something with CNCL with Amy. So,
Amy and Chris are both on the line, so we could poke
Yeah,
them right
hang
now.
on. I'm pretty sure I answered this one. I'm sorry, I had like a moment to be able to turn off mute here. We should have this. What's up?
You may have answered the question while I was at Christmas, and I've totally not read my email. That's entirely possible.
Ah, well, okay, I'm glad that we had this talk.
That's
Anna, check the question is about, since Notary is currently, even though Notary is a CNCF project and Tough is a CNCF project, but currently the code base of Notary V1 lives under the GitHub org of the update framework. So setting up
but there's a Notary
org
project org that we think CNCF owns, but no one could confirm it.
Yeah, I think we control. I think it was created in the early days when we were trying to figure out what to do with the project organization. You said Notary project is the GitHub org?
I think, yeah, it looked like it, but I mean, it had the Notary logo on it, but it's otherwise apparently empty.
Yeah. Oh man, we have some old school people on this thing. Yeah, we control it.
It's ours.
Okay, because we were thinking of using it for Notary V2 at least for now, for work in progress.
Cool. Go wild.
So,
you've been invited.
Cool.
Okay. That would have been weeks of an email thread.
Did someone say going old school?
Is that what the flag was that got you?
You don't say anything the whole time, Jeff, and then you type up on that.
I just noticed the people in the org. It was like Patrick Shanazon, David Lawrence.
Yeah.
No, I wasn't going to say anything, but at the beginning of this call, I was thinking just how things have nicely diversified over the last several months. And I do miss some of our former friends, but it's just nice to see things becoming as collaborative as they have over the last several years.
It's true. Yeah, it was something very, very encouraging about even that Notary kickoff that we had end of November, beginning of December, whatever it was. But yeah, this is really the one of the core places for open collaboration and solving some of these problems that affect all of us. So it's good.
Vincent and Derek, you were going to talk about and look at signature storage. I had some conversations with Derek after that meeting as well, but I think we kind of put you to how to store signatures in registries. I had a conversation with Derek like the day after for a few hours on that, and Derek had some strong opinions, but we kind of penciled you two in as being probably the people most.
Did you guys, so as we talk about the storage in the registry, did we scope out or find out a way that an artifact can be signed before it even gets into a registry, so that you basically, I have this thing on disk, it might be an IoT device, whatever it is, and I can verify it somehow. And then, okay, I push it to registry A or registry B, I could rename it, it doesn't matter. The signature is still traceable. So it's why I'm kind of poking on this is it's great that we can store it in a registry and we can do it in a consistent way. But is it the source of truth, or it's like, oh, I can store that as well, as opposed, you know what I mean? It's like if I use DLL, binaries on disk that I have as part of an operating system, things are signed. Doesn't matter how I got them there. Are we following a similar model?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, I think some of those questions come down to some questions around threat model and what mirroring looks like. But fundamentally, we're signing content hashes approximately, although we might actually be signing something that's a little bit more structured than that, like content hash plus size or content hash plus size plus something anyway. But roughly we're signing, and those exist whether something's in a registry or not, because they, as long as you've got the thing that is content, is it a content hash of the manifest or the content or something. But assuming you've got a manifest and it's the same manifest, then is you can store a signature in a file and it still outside of a registry corresponds to that piece of content, as long as you within the caveats of understanding what exactly you've signed, whether it's a manifest or not. But that might mean there's a separate file involved. But fundamentally, it should be understandable outside a registry.
Okay, awesome.
I mean, I think there's a few caveats, but I think that it should, in principle, work. There's nothing. I mean, a registry is just a way of storing content like hash, effectively. So from that point of view, it should be possible. And I think, I mean, that was one of the use cases that you wanted to make clear, obviously, because you brought this up before.
Yeah, it's, I have an artifact and I get it from one place. I get it from MCR, from Microsoft putting some software out that we want to be run on Amazon, but then it's downloaded to an IoT device that is not connected to anything because it's intentionally, separate. Can it be self-validated?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some questions about what metadata you need to validate things as well that are important to get out from the use cases about what you're, how, but what exactly, what exactly you need to do in those situations. But I mean, the tough model is just designed over files, and actually some of the notes on the threat model about how we didn't really map it very well to the registry model, and there's actually some bits of work that we've been discussing around actually doing the opposite of making it less file oriented and more registry oriented.
I gotcha.
Yeah, if I could just add to the topic.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry?
No, you go.
Yeah, if I could just add to the topic. Yeah, Justin's right. You can decouple the metadata and the image, for example, from the server, from the registry, and in principle, check everything. We have the same issue with CNAB, where sometimes things need to be in an offline environment. Some caveats include things like expiration of the metadata. They might expire rather quickly. So those are things we need to work around with, but in principle, it's doable.
And I'm sorry, it sounded like Derek you guys were going to talk about some registry specific storage stuff that he had an opinion on.
I was just going to say from the registry perspective, like we're storing these image spec manifests and we have hashes. Like those are kind of the storage primitives we have in the registry today. So like one of the things we talked about is like where does the signature go if it's part of the Merkle tree? Like it's kind of like you're signing a hash and then you create a new hash which has that signature, and it's kind of, you could keep layering that up and up and up. So like if we want to use just like the existing storage model, we could make that work. It could look kind of weird. I mean, we kind of did that with schema 1, and that wasn't very good. And if we put it above, then now we basically have added an extra like hop and stuff for every single request just to do that signature validation. So, I mean, that's just kind of some of the storage stuff I'm kind of thinking about. Like there's trade-offs to each of the different approaches. We should kind of like enumerate what that might be.
Yeah, I'd love to whiteboard that more. That was part of the straw man that John Johnson Jr. and myself were getting into, and somebody else, I think from Microsoft, I don't remember. No, right. Anyhow, that we were walking through a potential additional path, not terribly dissimilar from a distributed hash table in concept, in that you could push something to a record or almost do a reverse lookup. So there could be a potential. This is really the root of me asking about, an OEP, an OCI extension proposal for additional APIs to support signatures. So if a registry added a /sigs and then the same blob path, so that like when you're going to fetch a blob, if you have a signature on either a top level manifest or an image or something like that, that there would be a similar like /sigs and then SHA-256 and then a checksum, or what, we can figure that out. We were drawing out a straw man of like, you'd fetch that and you would get an array of the checksums of the signatures that have been pushed that reference that blob. So you could almost do a reverse lookup of any signatures that have been pushed to that registry, referencing that blob. And if one of them is in your root of trust, then you could act upon it accordingly. But that was part of that way of how to handle the layer, continue stacking up, or having somehow that be the signatures discoverable, but not changing the contents or producing a new digest of a thing that you have to trust.
The other thing that I talked to Derek about was, which at the moment there's no way of signing a tag, because you can't attach any metadata tags at the moment. And so that was another thing that we may want, because it's kind of, you can't actually validate that a tag is, you can't say I want to sign this tag to, in the same way as you can with a get tag at the moment. And that may well also be something that would want to do.
Yeah,
which again that would have to be an extension, because it's just there's no current way you can do that at all.
Well, but we assume there's going to be new APIs for the signing solution. So it's to say that's under the extensibility that a registry could say, I support feature, what do you call it, OEP? An OEP flag foo, then they could do it. Because the thing about having a tag, there's this tension between, hey, I should deploy things by digests, which are completely not human readable and don't even show up in kubectl dashboards that well, versus a tag which you can lock potentially, but you could also human read it. And that's the thing I want to reference. But I think part of what I was getting is that rose by any other name conversation was, I should just be able to sign this thing, and you're obviously signing the manifest because the manifest is the immutable thing. And then whatever I name it, that's fine, but the name should be able, if I name it X, X is signed. I could rename it Y, and Y still points to the same thing because it's still like renaming a file that is signed. It's still signed. But I think the concept that if a registry doesn't support tag signing today, whatever we come up with this Notary V2, I think there is a proposal to put in there for it. And that's part of what we talked about with a spec V2 was, this is an add-on thing we can add later on. It could be under an OEP flag or whatever. I'm not sure what the OEP flag is redundant, but That would be nice. I mean, I think that would be the goal there, and that there is, I can say this thing is signed by a human readable name. And that's, for me, it's a good point to make sure I'll include that in the scenarios and use cases.
One thing I wonder about the signing of the tags is that aren't the tags mutable?
Yes, yes, they are. And that's something that, I mean, that's partly why they need to be signed, because they are mutable, because you can't tell if they've been changed and as they're signed. So yeah, then there's the question of, like, if you sign a tag and it's mutable, can you get the past? What can you get a history of things that used to be, this used to be tagged as this, but then it changed to this, or not? And questions like, there's questions like that, or does it become, or does it just delete the signature if it gets changed and it becomes invalid?
This is the whole problem that Notary v1 solves, or I mean, it's the only problem it really solves, right? Like, is the point of v2 that it's just something completely different, or could you still use Notary v1 for tag signing, or is that just too much of a lost cause?
Yeah, you can, but the thing about Notary v1 is that the tags exist in two places. They're both in Notary and in the registry, and there's no guarantee they conform, and we want everything to be in the registry because we don't want to run a separate database on the side. So somehow we need to have one set of tags with the same signatures over them, or equivalent signatures over them.
Yeah, I guess it's just as soon as we get into the mutability question, we get back to like exactly what Notary v1 was designed to round tough for, which is kind of the solving that update problem.
I don't have the history of the 1.0 stuff, but I mean, we at least from an ACR perspective, and I assume this is a common thing because I've seen ECR conversations around this as well, we do support the idea of tag locking because people do want to be able to use those tags, but they want them to not be mutable or be immutable. And it's a feature we've had to add. It'd be good to push that up into the spec because I don't think that's something that should be unique to us. And then if we
it's not. I mean, Docker Trusted Registry had that flag as well, so it's not unique to you. I think it's
not generalized either in the spec. That's kind of.
I think there's some questions about what it means. I mean, if you delete a tag, is that, and then recreate it, is that okay or not? Like that, yeah.
So it'll be good to flush out some of those. Maybe the Notary v2 conversations around tag signing can drive some of these requirements into the spec. I mean, because I agree, unless we have some kind of tag immutability concept, it's kind of hard to have a good signing solution around tags. And to the conversation you guys were just talking about, like the way we wound up implementing Notary and Docker Content Trust is you can get in a spot where you can have a signed version of something and an unsigned version, and they're actually pointing of the exact same tag, and they're pointing at two different things. And whether we missed that is the right implementation of it, I don't know, but that's the way, I think that's the way I read the Docker docs, and we just implemented it that way. So the point is there's some vagueness, and we'd love to get some clarity, clean that up.
Yeah, I mean, Derek, the point is not to necessarily change the way things were done, but the point is that everyone needs to agree that the way that we're doing things is the right way of doing things. So we're prepared to revisit things just to make sure we all agree whether we change them or not. But I think that we want to kind of cover all the kind of skeletons that people find problematic, and the fact that we definitely want the data to all be in the registry, which I think is something that there's kind of a base point that it should be in the registry, and therefore in the registry you don't want to have the ability to have inconsistent tags because it just doesn't make sense. So there should be, whether there's a choice of signed or unsigned tags or something, you shouldn't be able to have both.
Right.
Does that make sense, Derek?
Yeah. Are you gonna follow up with scheduling that other meeting? I mean, we're at time now, so I don't want to continue the discussion too much right here.
I'll suggest some times on Slack. It's probably the easiest thing.
Sounds good.
Cool. Yeah, that's right. We have so many ways to chat also. So the OCI channel for some stuff, whether you're on IRC or Matrix or Slack or whatever, but then for notary stuff on the CNCF Slack server, there's Notary V2 channel. So with that, we're 2 minutes over, but good discussion. If you have any other notes to add to the HackMD, do that imminently. I will post and add the link to the HackMD doc once the video is uploaded to the OCI channel. Thanks everybody for joining, and I'll see you online.
Happy New Year, everyone.
See you guys. Thanks. Where will the doodle go? Will it go to the Notary V2 channel?
You can post that to the dev at Open Containers list or V2 channel.
Okay, cool.
Justin. We'll share it out.